She never planned to save him. But when Baek Joon, the man all of Seoul feared, arrived at that hospital with his heart failing and every doctor suddenly had somewhere else to be, Nora Eze walked into that room alone and refused to let him go. For minutes without a heartbeat. 22 minutes of fighting death with nothing but her hands and her training. And when he finally opened his eyes and found her face, something in him never looked away again. Before you dive deeper into this story of love, danger, and a choice that changed everything, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You will not want to miss what happens when the most powerful man in Seoul cannot stop thinking about the woman who brought him back to life. Drop a comment below and tell us the country you are watching from. Nora had not planned to be in Seoul. She had planned residency in London, a surgical fellowship in Toronto, a career built on precision and sacrifice and the kind of quiet excellence that required no audience. She had planned all of it from a small room in Enugu, Nigeria, with medical textbooks stacked to the ceiling and a mother who told her every night that brilliance was not arrogance, it was responsibility. What she had not planned was her father's debt. The kind that arrived after death, silent and enormous, eating through everything he had left behind. The kind that made London and Toronto dissolve into abstraction, while reality reasserted itself in the form of numbers that did not care about plans. Seoul had been a fellowship opportunity she applied for without expecting to receive. A surgical program at Yonsei Medical Center, competitive, prestigious, the kind that came with a salary generous enough to send money home and still survive. She had received the acceptance letter on a Tuesday morning and sat with it in her hands for a long time before she allowed herself to believe it. That had been 2 years ago. She was 30 now. A cardiac surgeon with hands that did not shake and a reputation in the hospital built entirely on results. Her colleagues respected her. Some resented her for the same reason. She had learned to find both irrelevant. She was finishing her evening rounds on a Friday when Baek Joon arrived. She heard the commotion before she saw it. Raised voices at the emergency entrance. The particular urgency of staff moving with purpose. She turned the corridor corner and found the cardiac bay transformed into something that felt less like a hospital and more like a controlled crisis. 4 men in dark suits occupied the room's perimeter. Hands visible, faces unreadable. The kind of men whose presence meant the patient was either very important or very dangerous or both. The attending on call, Dr. Park, senior and experienced, assessed the situation in 3 seconds and developed an urgent need to be elsewhere. Nora walked in. On the central bay bed lay a man in full cardiac arrest. Tall, dark-suited, his face pale and composed even in unconsciousness, like someone who had decided that even this would be endured with dignity. The monitors screamed. A nurse was performing compressions. Another was preparing the defibrillator. "What happened?" Nora said, already moving, already pulling on gloves. "Suspected poisoning. Something in his drink at a private event. Heart went into arrest in the car on the way here." The nurse's voice was steady but her eyes were wide. "He's been down 4 minutes. 4 minutes was the number that separated recoverable from irreversible." Nora moved to the bed. "Everyone listen to me," she said. Her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had been in this exact position before and knew precisely what needed to happen. "We are bringing him back. Let's go." The next 22 minutes were the longest of her career. She did not think about who he was. She did not think about the men in suits watching from the doorway or the phone calls being made in urgent Korean in the corridor outside. She thought about the rhythm on the monitor and the medication dosages and the precise sequence of interventions that gave a stopped heart the best possible reason to start again. She thought about keeping him alive. She was very good at keeping people alive. When the monitor shifted from the flat, terrible line to the jagged, beautiful, irregular proof of a heartbeat returning, the room exhaled collectively. Her resident made a sound beside her that was almost a sob. Nora watched the monitor for 10 full seconds, confirming, verifying, making absolutely certain. Then she stepped back and breathed. "Stabilize and monitor," she said quietly. Full tox panel. I want results in 20 minutes. She walked out of the bay and stood in the corridor and pressed her back against the wall and let the shaking come. Just for a moment, just 30 seconds, the delayed physical response to the intensity of what had just happened. She allowed it because she had learned that denying it entirely made it worse later. Then she straightened, rolled her shoulders, and went back to work. He was conscious by morning. She did her rounds early, moving through her patients with focused efficiency, leaving his room for last without examining why. When she pushed open the door, he was already awake. Not groggy. Not disoriented. Awake with the complete, focused presence of a man who did not do anything halfway, including regaining consciousness after cardiac arrest. He was sitting up against the pillows and his eyes went to her face the moment she entered and stayed there with an attention that felt immediate and absolute. She picked up his chart. How are you feeling? Alive, he said. His voice was low and slightly rough but entirely controlled. Which I'm told is you're doing. Your heart did most of the work. She made a notation. I just persuaded it. A pause. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Intent and still, like a man encountering something he found genuinely surprising, and was taking his time deciding what to do about it. You were the only doctor who stayed in the room, he said. Dr. Park had a conflict. Something moved in his expression. The ghost of something dry and knowing. Is that what we're calling it? She held his gaze steadily. You're going to need monitoring for the next 72 hours. The toxicology results will determine the treatment going forward. You should rest. She moved toward the door. His voice stopped her. Doctor. A pause. I don't know your name. She turned. Eze. Dr. Nora Eze. He said it quietly, once with the deliberateness of someone filing something important. Nigerian. Yes. You're far from home. The observation landed simply, without performance, just a fact acknowledged, and it reached somewhere inside her that she immediately moved to protect. So are you, she said evenly. From wherever you're supposed to be. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost a smile. The very first she had seen from him. She left before it could finish forming. The following days rearranged themselves around his presence in ways she did not entirely sanction. He was technically a model patient. He followed instructions. He took his medication without complaint. He did not attempt to leave against medical advice the way powerful men in her experience usually did, treating recovery like an inconvenience rather than a necessity. What he did was watch her. Not obtrusively. Not in a way she could formally object to. But every time she entered his room he was already oriented toward the door. His attention shifting to her face with the immediate focus of someone who had decided she was the most interesting thing in the room, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He asked questions. Intelligent ones about the cardiac episode, about the toxicology, about the precise mechanism of what she had done to bring him back. She answered clinically, maintaining the professional distance the situation required. On the third day he asked about Nigeria. She paused in her notation. That's not a medical question. No, he agreed, entirely unrepentant. She looked up. He was watching her with that same patient attention, unhurried and direct. The attention of a man who had decided he was interested in something and had no intention of hiding it. Enugu, she said finally. I'm from Enugu. What is it like? Something loosened in her chest against her better judgment. Loud, she said. Green. The kind of place that gets into your bones and stays there no matter how far you go. He was quiet for a moment. Then simply, I know that feeling. And the way he said it, without decoration or performance, made her believe him completely. She finished her notation and left before the conversation became something she would have to examine later. She examined it later anyway. On the fifth day, flowers appeared on the nurse's station. Not a generic hospital arrangement. Specific flowers, birds of paradise and deep orange dahlias, vivid and deliberate, chosen by someone who understood that beauty was particular and not general. The card had no name. The head nurse raised her eyebrows at Nora when she passed. Nora kept walking. That evening her favorite coffee sat on her office desk. The specific blend she ordered from a small Nigerian import shop on the east side of the city, the one she had mentioned to absolutely no one in this hospital because it was the kind of detail you kept to yourself when you were building a life somewhere that wasn't home. She stood at her desk and looked at the coffee for a long moment. Then she picked up his chart and walked to his room with considerably more purpose than strictly necessary. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face when he saw her arrive with that particular energy was the closest thing to unguarded she had seen from him. Something warm and almost amused, quickly composed but not quickly enough. "The coffee," she said. "Is it the wrong kind?" "How did you know what kind?" He held her gaze. "I asked." "You asked who?" "Nobody here knows." "I have resources," he said simply. Not boastful. Just factual the way he said most things. "I wanted you to have something from home." The room was very quiet. Outside the window Seoul moved and hummed and went about its Friday evening entirely unaware of what was happening in this small hospital room, which was that Nora Eze was standing at the foot of a bed holding a patient chart and feeling something she had not felt in a very long time crack open in her chest like a window letting in air. "That was unnecessary," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I don't need." "I know you don't need it." His eyes held hers. "That's not why I did it." She stood there for a moment longer than she should have. Then she set the chart down with the careful precision of a woman who needed something to do with her hands and walked out. In the corridor she stood still and breathed and told herself very firmly that what was happening had a clinical explanation. Transference. Gratitude. The natural human tendency to attach significance to someone who had been present at a moment of crisis. She was a surgeon. She understood the brain's capacity for narrative. She was not entirely convinced. He was discharged on the 8th day. She delivered the news herself, professional and thorough, outlining the follow-up appointments, the dietary restrictions, the monitoring protocol his private physician would need to maintain. He listened with his full attention, the way he did everything, and when she finished he looked at her for a moment in silence. "I'd like to continue my follow-up care here," he said. "With you specifically. That's not standard procedure for." "I'm aware." His eyes didn't move from her face. "I'm requesting it anyway." She should have said no. There were a dozen clean professional reasons to redirect him to a colleague, to maintain the boundary that the situation clearly required, to protect the careful equilibrium she had built over 2 years in this city. She looked at him sitting in that hospital bed. This man who had been brought to her near death and chosen to spend his recovery asking about her home and sending her coffee and watching her with eyes that made her feel like the most seen she had ever been in her adult life. "Once a week," she said. "Standard follow-up protocol. Nothing outside that." Something in his expression shifted. Quiet and warm and enormous. "Once a week," he agreed. She left. In the elevator going down she pressed the button for her floor and leaned against the wall and closed her eyes and felt the smile she had been refusing for 8 days arrive completely without her permission. The following weeks established a rhythm she told herself was entirely professional. Every Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon, Baek Joon arrived at her clinic. Always exactly on time. Always alone, which she understood was not his default existence but a deliberate choice. A gesture of normalcy in a life that had very little of it. He sat across from her desk while she reviewed his results and asked questions that were half medical and half simply conversation, and she answered both with decreasing resistance as the weeks passed. She learned things about him in those Tuesday hours. That he read history obsessively, specifically the kind that dealt with the collapse of empires, which he found instructive rather than depressing. That he had learned to cook during a period in his 20s when circumstances required him to be entirely self-sufficient and had discovered, to his own surprise, that he was good at it. That he had a younger sister he spoke about with a softness entirely absent from every other aspect of how he moved through the world. That he was lonely in the particular way of people who are surrounded by loyalty they have purchased rather than earned, and who understand the difference acutely. He learned things about her too. That she ran at 5 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, which was often. That she called her mother every Sunday without exception, and that those calls were the hinge on which her entire week turned. That she had wanted to be a surgeon since she was 7 years old, and had watched a doctor save her brother's life in a clinic with equipment that barely functioned, using nothing but training and will. That she was the most capable person in most rooms she entered and had learned, out of necessity, to make that fact invisible. On the 6th Tuesday he looked at her across the desk and said, "You do that thing." She looked up. "What thing?" "Where you make yourself smaller than you are. Mid-conversation. Like you remember you're not supposed to take up too much space." The observation was so precise and so unexpected that she had no immediate response. She sat with it for a moment, this man watching her with quiet certainty, and felt something move through her that was uncomfortably close to being understood. "Old habit," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I notice when you stop doing it." She held his gaze. "When do I stop?" "When you're talking about medicine." A pause. "When you forget I'm supposed to be intimidating." The corner of her mouth moved before she could stop it. "You're not that intimidating." Something lit in his eyes. Warm and sudden. "Dr. Eze," he said, and the way he said her name like it was something he enjoyed saying, "that is the nicest thing you've said to me in 6 weeks." She laughed. Surprised both of them. Real and unguarded, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can curate it. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth and looked away and felt warmth move through her from her chest to her fingertips. When she looked back he was watching her with an expression that made her breath shorten involuntarily. Unguarded and devoted and entirely unashamed of both. "June," she said softly. "A warning. A question." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything, Nora. I just want you to know that I see you. All of it. And I think it's extraordinary." The clinic was very quiet. She looked at this man who had arrived in her life at the edge of death and chosen, every Tuesday since, to sit across from her and learn who she was with the patient devotion of someone who had decided she was worth every moment of the effort. She was a surgeon. She understood the physiology of what was happening in her chest. She understood it completely and it helped not at all. Trouble arrived on a Thursday wearing expensive perfume. Her name was Shin Yuna, and she walked into Yonsei Medical Center with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told she couldn't go somewhere. She was beautiful in the precise, polished way of women who have made beauty a discipline, and she asked for Dr. Eze at the reception desk with the pleasant smile of someone who had already decided how the conversation would go. Nora met her in the corridor outside her office. Yuna looked at her with a gaze that was assessing and brief, the look of a woman cataloging a threat and deciding how seriously to take it. Then she smiled. "I'll be direct," she said. "June and I have an understanding. Our families have an understanding. Whatever is happening in your Tuesday appointments is a complication nobody needs." Nora looked at her evenly. "Mr. Baek is my patient. Our appointments are medical." "Of course they are." The smile didn't waver. "I'm simply suggesting that perhaps another cardiologist could manage his follow-up care equally well. For everyone's comfort." "Is Mr. Baek uncomfortable?" Flicker. "Just one. I'm asking as a courtesy," Yuna said. "Before it becomes something else." Nora held her gaze for a long steady moment. "I appreciate the visit," she said. "Have a good evening." She walked into her office and closed the door and stood with her back against it and breathed slowly. Then she sat at her desk and looked at her hands and thought about Tuesday, And the way he laughed at something she said, and the coffee that kept appearing on her desk every Friday without explanation, and the expression on his face when she forgot to make herself small. She thought about Yuna's smile that was not a smile. She thought about what it cost to want something in a world that had already decided it belonged to someone else. She was in the hospital rooftop garden at 6 the following morning when she heard the door. She knew his step. She had learned it without meaning to, the particular rhythm of a man who moved with deliberate economy. She didn't turn around. He came to stand beside her at the railing. The city was silver and quiet below them, still finding its morning. They stood in silence for a moment, the comfortable kind, the kind that had developed between them over 6 Tuesdays without either of them sanctioning it. "She came to see you," he said. "Yes. I didn't ask her to." "I know." He turned to look at her profile. She kept her eyes on the city. "Nora. It's fine, June." "It's not fine." His voice was quiet but certain. "And I need you to know that whatever she said to you, whatever she implied, she does not speak for me." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him. This man standing in the early morning with the city behind him and something in his eyes that he was no longer trying to conceal. "What are we doing?" she said softly. "I think you know what I want to do," he said. "I've been fairly transparent. You have a complicated life." "Yes. I am your doctor. You were my doctor. My follow-up protocol ends next week." His eyes held hers. "I've been counting." Something moved through her, warm and unstoppable. "June, I'm not asking you to decide anything now." He turned back to the city, giving her space, which was so precisely what she needed that it undid her slightly. "I'm just asking you not to disappear." She looked at his profile. Sharp and still and quietly devoted in the early morning light. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. He exhaled slowly. And the smile that followed, real and unhurried and entirely unguarded, was the most beautiful thing she had seen in 2 years in this city that was not her home. She turned back to the city and let herself smile too, facing forward where he couldn't see it. But she thought he knew anyway. If Nora and June already have your heart, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because the danger is coming, the feelings are becoming impossible to ignore. And Baek Joon is about to show this woman exactly how far he will go to keep her safe and to keep her. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think of June so far. We read every single one. The last Tuesday came and went like a door closing softly. Nora conducted the final follow-up with the same clinical precision she had maintained for 7 weeks, reviewing his results, confirming his recovery, documenting everything with the thorough professionalism that had defined every appointment. His heart was strong. His numbers were excellent. He was, by every medical measure, fully recovered. She signed the discharge summary and slid it across the desk. He looked at it, then at her. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "You know that." "Your heart did the work," she said. The same thing she had said on the first morning. A full circle. "You keep saying that." His eyes held hers. "One day you're going to let someone give you the credit you deserve." She capped her pen. "Goodbye, June." He stood. He took the discharge summary. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back one final time. And the look on his face was so completely open and so completely him that she felt it land somewhere permanent inside her. "Dinner," he said. "Friday. Not as your patient. Just as a man who has been waiting 8 weeks to ask you properly." The clinic was very quiet. She thought about Yuna's smile, about complicated lives and family arrangements and the careful equilibrium she had spent 2 years constructing in this city that still did not entirely feel like hers. She thought about coffee appearing on her desk every Friday, about birds of paradise, about a man who noticed when she stopped making herself small. 7 o'clock, she said. "Don't be late." The smile that broke across his face was slow and brilliant and entirely worth every week of waiting. He left. Nora sat at her empty desk and pressed both hands flat against its surface and breathed, and felt the specific terror of a woman who has spent years surviving everything alone, and is only now beginning to understand what it might feel like not to. He was not late. He arrived at 6:58 in a dark car that stopped outside the restaurant she had chosen deliberately, somewhere small and quiet and entirely her selection, because she had needed that control, that small declaration that this was her life and her city too, and she was not simply being collected. He was wearing dark clothes, no tie, nothing performative, and when he saw her waiting outside he smiled before he could stop himself, and she felt her stomach do something she had no clinical term for. They ate at a corner table for 3 hours. She had expected it to be different outside the clinic. Awkward with the removal of the professional structure that had organized them for 2 months. Instead it was simply more of what Tuesday afternoons had already been, the conversation that moved between serious and easy, the way he listened with his entire attention, the way he asked about her mother and remembered what she had said the week before and built on it, showing her without announcement that she was being retained, catalogued, kept. He told her about his sister Jisoo, 24 and studying architecture in Paris, the person he was most proud of in the world. His voice when he spoke about her was entirely different from every other register he used, softer, more open, like a room in an otherwise fortified building where the windows had been left unlocked. "She doesn't know what I am," Nora said carefully. "What you do. She knows enough." A pause. "She knows I kept her safe. She's chosen not to examine the details. Is that sustainable?" He looked at her. "You ask the questions other people are afraid to. I'm a doctor. I've learned that avoiding hard questions costs more than asking them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know if it's sustainable. I know it's what I have." He held her gaze. "I'm trying to build something different. It takes time." She believed him. She was not certain she should. She believed him anyway. When he walked her to the hospital residence entrance at the end of the evening, he stopped at the door and looked at her in the lamplight and said nothing for a moment, just looked, with that devoted, unhurried attention that she had stopped trying to deflect. "Nora," he said. "Yes. Thank you for Friday." She smiled. "Thank you for not being late." He reached out and tucked a loose lock behind her ear, his fingers grazing her cheek, there and gone, barely a breath of contact, and then stepped back and gave her space and said good night with the self-possession of a man who understood that patience was its own kind of devotion. She went inside and stood in the elevator and pressed the button for her floor, and felt warmth move through her from the place his fingers had been all the way down. The following weeks were the best she had spent in Seoul. They moved carefully and deliberately, the way two people move when they understand that what is between them is worth protecting. Dinners on Fridays. Walks on Sunday mornings when her schedule allowed, through the quieter parts of the city, the parts that felt human rather than architectural. Phone calls that started as 10 minutes and became an hour without either of them noticing. He showed up at the hospital once, unannounced, on a Wednesday when she had back-to-back surgeries and had forgotten to eat. He left food at the nurse's station with a note that said simply, "Eat. Baek Joon." The nurses talked about it for a week. Nora ate her food at her desk and smiled at her wall and felt something she recognized, with the diagnostic precision of a woman who had spent years identifying things she could not treat, as happiness. Quiet, careful, unprecedented happiness. She called her mother on Sunday and did not mention him. Her mother, who had raised her and therefore knew everything, said, "You sound different." "I'm fine, Mama. Different is not bad." A pause. "Different is good, Nora. You are allowed good things." She sat with that after she hung up. The radical simplicity of it. You are allowed good things. She was still sitting with it when her phone rang and Joon's name appeared on the screen, and she answered it before the second ring with a speed she declined to analyze. The danger arrived on a Tuesday, which felt like an insult to the day that had given her so much. She was leaving the hospital at 8 in the evening, later than planned, her bag over her shoulder, her mind already on the phone call she was going to make from the car, when a man she did not recognize fell into step beside her on the path to the parking structure. "Dr. Eze," he said pleasantly. In English. She kept walking. "I don't know you." "No. But I know you." He kept pace easily. "I know you've been spending considerable time with Baek Joon. I know you're important to him." A pause. "That makes you useful to us." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. He was smiling the way people smile when they want you to understand that the smile is a choice and what it's replacing is worse. "We're not going to do anything dramatic. We just need you to deliver a message. And perhaps occasionally share information about his health, his medications, his schedule." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Her pulse was elevated. She cataloged that clinically and set it aside. "I don't share patient information," she said, "with anyone. For any reason. He's not your patient anymore." The smile didn't waver. "And you should think carefully about what matters to you here. Your career. Your visa status." A pause. "Your mother's treatment back in Enugu." The mention of her mother was the precise moment she stopped being afraid and became something colder and more focused. "I'd like you to step away from me," she said quietly. "Now." He studied her face. Whatever he found there made the smile flicker slightly. "Think about it," he said. "We'll be in touch." He walked away. Nora stood on the hospital path for 30 seconds, breathing deliberately, organizing what had just happened into something she could act on. Then she took out her phone and called Joon. He answered on the first ring. "Someone just approached me outside the hospital," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "I need to tell you what happened." The silence on his end lasted 2 seconds. When he spoke, his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it, which she understood by now was not calm. It was the opposite of calm, compressed into something controlled and absolute. "Don't move," he said. "I'm coming." He arrived in 11 minutes. She had waited in the lit entrance of the hospital in a public space, which she had judged the appropriate response to the situation. When the black car stopped and he stepped out and crossed to her with a pace that was controlled but barely, she saw on his face something she had never seen there before. Fear. Real and undisguised, lasting only the second it took him to confirm she was physically unharmed. Then it compressed back into the cold, focused authority that was his default. But she had seen it and she understood exactly what it meant. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He looked at her face, assessing, verifying. Then he exhaled once, short and deliberate. "Tell me everything." She did. Every word she could remember, every detail, the man's appearance, his phrasing, the specific mention of her mother. Joon listened without interrupting, his expression still, his eyes moving with the precision of someone building a complete picture from every piece of information offered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They've been watching us," he said. Not to her exactly. To the situation. "Yes." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry. This is because of me." "I know that," she said. "I'm not angry at you." A pause. "I need you to tell me honestly what we're dealing with." He held her gaze. The honesty she had come to rely on, the thing that had made her trust him before she was ready to, arrived without hesitation. A rival faction. People I dismantled 18 months ago who have been rebuilding. They can't get to me directly, so they look for leverage. His jaw tightened. "They identified you. What do they want?" "To destabilize me." His voice dropped. "They calculated correctly that you are the most effective way to do that." The admission hung in the air between them, enormous and undecorated. She was his vulnerability. He was saying so plainly, without deflection, without managing the implication. She looked at him in the lit entrance of the hospital where she had worked for 2 years. This man who had arrived in her life near death and stayed by choice, who sent coffee and remembered details and showed up on Wednesdays with food and said her name like it was something worth keeping. "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay. Tell me what we need to do." Something moved across his face, enormous and quickly controlled. "Nora, I'm not running," she said simply. "I'm not disappearing. I'm asking what we do next." She held his gaze. "Together." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, both of his around hers, warm and steady and deliberate. "Together," he said quietly, like a promise. The following days tightened everything. Security around Nora increased in ways she had negotiated carefully with June, present but not intrusive, protective without making her feel like a possession. A car to and from the hospital. Someone stationed near her building. Check-ins that she insisted be calls rather than surveillance. He respected every boundary. He also, she noticed, found reasons to be nearby. He worked from a mobile office 3 days out of 5 that week, which she understood required significant logistical rearrangement, and which he mentioned not at all. He simply appeared at lunch at the end of her shift, at the corner table of the coffee shop near the hospital where she took her breaks, with his laptop and his focused attention and the particular quality of presence that made a room feel different. Her colleagues noticed. Her resident, a young man named Dr. Shin who had the social awareness of someone who had studied people more than textbooks, appeared at her elbow on Thursday morning with the expression of someone trying very hard to be professional about something deeply unprofessional. "The man in the coffee shop," he said. "Dr. Shin. He's been there every day this week. I'm aware. He's..." A pause. "He looks at you like..." "Dr. Shin." She handed him a chart. "Rounds." He took the chart with the quiet devastation of someone whose question would remain permanently unanswered and walked away. Nora allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of a smile before she followed. The complication arrived in the form of Shinyuna on a Friday afternoon. She came to the hospital again, which Nora had not expected, and this time there was no pleasant smile. She found Nora in the corridor outside cardiology, and looked at her with an expression that had dropped all pretense. "He's pulling away from the arrangement," she said. "His family is asking questions. My family is asking questions." She paused. "You need to understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Nora said evenly. "Do you?" Yuna's voice was careful and precise, the voice of a woman who was not accustomed to losing, and had not yet fully accepted that she was. "You're a foreign national on a work visa. You have family obligations at home. You have a career you've spent years building." She paused. "June's world is not a place people walk into and remain intact. I grew up in it. I know what it costs." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at this woman, beautiful and brittle and standing in a hospital corridor fighting for something she had been given rather than chosen, and felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite its absence. "I appreciate that you're afraid," Nora said quietly. "But this conversation is between June and his family, not between you and me." Yuna looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Something complicated and almost honest. "He's never looked at anyone the way he looks at you," she said finally. It cost her something to say it. That was visible. "I needed you to know I'm aware of that." Then she turned and walked away. Nora stood in the corridor and breathed and felt the weight of everything that conversation contained settle over her slowly. She called June. "Yuna came to the hospital," she said when he answered. A silence. "I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize." A pause. "But we need to talk. Tonight. I'll come to you." "Yes," she said. "You should." He came at 8. She had made tea because she needed something to do with her hands and because the ritual of it calmed her. The small familiar act imported from a home that lived in her bones no matter how far she traveled from it. They sat in her small living room, the one she had made careful and particular over 2 years, the photographs of her mother and her city and the friends she had left behind arranged on a shelf that was the most honest corner of her life in Seoul. He looked at the shelf for a moment, then at her. "Talk to me," he said. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Your family's arrangement with the Shins. Is it binding?" "Contractually, no. Socially." He paused. "It creates friction to end it." "What kind of friction?" "The kind I can manage." His eyes held hers. "If I choose to." "June." "I've already chosen, Nora." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I chose the morning I asked you to dinner. I chose every Friday since. I need you to understand that the question of Yuna has an answer, and the answer is not complicated." She set down her cup. "Your world tried to use me against you this week." "Yes. That will happen again." "Probably. I need to know that you understand what you're asking me to walk into." She met his eyes. "I'm not afraid. But I need honesty. Full honesty. Not the managed version." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on her face with the complete and focused attention that was the most honest thing about him. "My world is dangerous and complicated, and I am working every day to reshape it into something different. That is true and slow and not yet finished." A pause. "You are the clearest reason I have found to work faster." The room was very quiet. She looked at him, this man, and thought about everything she had survived to sit in this room. Her father's debt and her mother's illness and 14-hour shifts and a career built in a country that had made her prove herself twice for everything. She thought about what it meant to be seen fully without performance by someone who had no agenda for it. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. "So am I," he said immediately. "Nora, I have not been afraid of anything in 10 years. You terrify me completely." Something broke open in her chest, wide and warm and irreversible. She reached across the space between them. He met her halfway. What happened next was slow and inevitable. Two people who had been orbiting each other for months finally closing the distance. And it was made entirely of honesty and relief and the particular tenderness of two people who had both been alone in different ways, choosing, finally, not to be. The lights stayed low. The city hummed outside. And what passed between them needed no description because it was simply true. She woke before dawn. For a moment she simply lay still and looked at the ceiling and took inventory of how she felt, the way she had learned to do after significant events, clinically, honestly. She felt, she concluded, like herself. Fully. Without apology. He was awake beside her, she could tell by his breathing. And when she turned he was already looking at her with that expression she had stopped trying to name because it was simply his face when it was entirely unguarded, devoted and warm and permanently oriented toward her. "You're not running," he said softly. "I told you," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He reached out and tucked a lock behind her ear with the same gesture from the restaurant entrance weeks ago, but slower this time, more deliberate, his hand staying against her face. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "The arrangement with the Shin family ends this week. I'm telling my family today." His eyes held hers. "I want to be clear about where I stand. About what I want." "June." "You," he said simply. "That's what I want. Clearly. Without complication. You." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she placed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Okay." The smile that arrived on his face was the slow, brilliant one she had first seen in the clinic doorway, the one that transformed everything it touched. The next 72 hours were the most turbulent she had spent in Seoul. June's announcement to his family generated exactly the friction he had predicted and managed with the methodical calm of a man who had prepared for every objection. His mother called twice. His father's lawyers made noises that resolved themselves when Joon's own legal team responded. The Shin family issued a statement through intermediaries that was dignified and final. Yoona did not contact Nora again. The rival faction made one more approach, a message delivered through a third party that was designed to intimidate. Joon's response was swift and comprehensive, and she did not ask for the details and he did not offer them, which was a boundary they had established and would continue to maintain. Through all of it, he called her every evening. Not to report, just to talk. About her day, about his sister's latest letter from Paris, about the history book he was reading and the passage that had made him think of something she had said 3 weeks ago. On the third evening she said, "You're managing all of this and you still call me every night." "The calls are not management," he said. "The calls are the reason I get through the management." She sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against her ear, the Seoul night outside her window, her mother's photograph on the shelf. "I called my mother today," she said. "I told her about you." A pause. "What did she say?" "She asked if you were kind." "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." A pause. "She said that was the only thing that mattered." The silence that followed was full and warm and entirely comfortable. "I'd like to speak with her," he said. "Someday. If she's willing." Nora closed her eyes. "She'll like you," she said quietly. "She likes people who are honest." "Then she'll love me," he said simply. "Because I have never been more honest with anyone in my life than I am with you." 3 months later, on a clear autumn evening, he took her to the rooftop of a building she had never been to, on the edge of the Han River. The whole city laid out below them like something that had been arranged specifically for this moment. There were lights strung along the railing. Her favorite flowers in tall arrangements she recognized immediately. Birds of paradise and deep orange dahlias. The same as the nurse's station on the 5th day. The same table for 2. She stopped when she saw it. He stopped beside her and watched her face. "You remembered," she said softly. "I remember everything," he said. "Always." They ate dinner as the city glittered below them and the conversation moved the way it always did. Easy and deep and entirely theirs. When the plates were gone and the night had settled around them like something generous, he reached into his jacket and placed a small box on the table. She looked at it, then at him. His face was open in the way it only ever was with her, unguarded and devoted and slightly undone, the face of a man who had survived everything and found, on the other side of it, this. "I didn't come into your life cleanly," he said. "I came in at the worst possible moment, unconscious, and you brought me back with your hands and your training and a refusal to leave that I have thought about every single day since." His voice was steady but his eyes were not entirely. "You gave me my life back. And then, somehow, you gave me something better than the one I had." She felt tears arrive at the back of her eyes that she did not try to stop. "Nora Eze." He opened the box. Simple and perfect, chosen with the same attention he gave everything. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known. You are brilliant and strong and you make yourself small for a world that doesn't deserve it, and I want to spend every remaining day I have making sure you never feel the need to do that again." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about Enugu and London and Toronto and Seoul and a career built in the dark and a mother who said you are allowed good things and a man who arrived at the edge of death and chose her, kept choosing her, would choose her. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed, the real one, the full one she had first heard in her clinic and collected like something rare. And she was laughing too as he slid the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him forward by his lapels and they were together in the rooftop lights above the city that had become, without her entirely noticing, home. 8 months later, on a Sunday morning when the light came through the curtains in long gold bars, Nora stood in their bathroom holding a test and staring at 2 lines. She had been standing there for 3 minutes when Joon knocked softly and opened the door. He read her face before he read anything else. He always did. His eyes dropped to her hand, then back to her face. What happened to his expression was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Something enormous and unguarded and completely undone, arriving all at once. A man who had spent his whole life controlling everything losing control of his face entirely and not caring at all. He crossed to her in 2 steps and took both her hands, the test and the hand holding it, and held on. Nora, he said. Just her name. But it contained everything, the rooftop and the clinic and the coffee on her desk, and the Tuesday afternoons and the morning she brought him back from the edge of death and changed both their lives without knowing it. She pressed her forehead to his. We're going to be someone's family, she whispered. We already are, he said. He wrapped his arms around her slowly and she felt the steadiness of him, this man. And the city moved outside their window and her mother's photograph smiled from the shelf, and somewhere in Paris his sister was opening a letter that would make her cry happy tears, and the world was large and complicated and full of danger. And here in this room, in this life she had built from necessity and loss and the refusal to stop believing she deserved something real, it was also full of this. Of him. Of her. Of everything they had chosen, fully and without reservation, to become. If this story moved you, if Nora and June made your heart feel something real, smash that like button. Share this with someone who needs a love story today. And subscribe so you never miss what we bring next. Drop a comment below and tell us the moment you knew June was completely gone for her. Was it the coffee? The flowers? Or the moment he showed up in 11 minutes? We read every single one. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next story.